Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series where I speak to people that can help us to better understand human decision making and what we can do to mitigate the risks it poses. Now, if there are industries that ought to be able to adapt their thinking to meet the challenges posed by COVID, then you'd think it'd be creatives. The clue is in the name. After all, if your job is to present a different perspective and think creatively, then you've got the tools you need to be able to think of smart ways to adapt. But as we've seen during the pandemic, the creative industries are facing similar problems to other businesses. A lack of diversity, business models that are heavily reliant on particular income streams, and in some cases, such as theatres and live concert venues, the very real risk of a threat to their existence. What's happening? Why? What can the arts do to recover? And what might business learn from the arts and vice versa is what I explore with my guest on this episode, Mark Heywood. Earlier in 2020, Mark joined me on the podcast to explore how COVID was impacting the creative industries. There's a link to that episode in the show notes, and to help you find it, this is episode 98 of the series, and Mark's original appearance was on episode 19. Given so much has happened since we last spoke, I thought I'd get him back for an update and to explore how the pandemic has highlighted some of the human risk dynamics inherent in the creative industries. In our discussion, we catch up on what Mark's been up to since we last spoke and explore the challenges on an industry that has often survived without always adapting to changes in society. As ever, Mark's insights into an industry he cares passionately about are fascinating, both generally, but also from a human risk perspective. So please enjoy my conversation with Mark Heywood on human risk in the creative industries. Mark Heywood, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It seems both like yesterday and a lifetime ago, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Actually, I didn't look when it was. I think it was around about March time, but I recall us having some very early conversations about what lockdown felt like. And the bit that we focused on there was sort of what you were doing at that time. And I do want to make sure my listeners have caught up with what's happened in the soap opera that is Mark Heywood's life since then. So what have you been doing?
Well, like all good soap operas, we now call them continuing dramas these days, Christian. So my life continues to be dramatic and a daily dose of anxiety at the people in the park and how close they are to each other. But no, it does. It feels both like yesterday and also like a lifetime ago. I think you're right. I think it was March, April time. I'm astonished that, 2020 has just disappeared in a flash. It's been incredible. And I feel very lucky to say that it's been one of the busiest periods of my creative professional career ever. I've been involved in more things than I expected. And I think there's a particular quirk at this. Some of it has been planned. Some of it has come out of the woodwork from people who've asked me to get involved in certain projects. Some stuff got initially delayed and then brought back when things calmed down. We managed to get a TV pilot shot in lockdown. It was scheduled to shoot at the end of March. Obviously, that got cancelled. We managed to do it in August, and everybody bubbled. Everybody was safe. Everybody was socially distanced, and we managed to get it done in a very short period of time. And what was interesting was talking to one of the actors on the show. He said for the first time since drama school, whenever the director or the AD yelled cut, nobody was running up to him with a makeup brush or a costume change or a script supervisor saying, no, you need to do this with the third finger of your right hand, not the first finger of your left hand. Otherwise you screw up the continuity. And he said it was a real joy. It was a real back to basics experience. I mean, it was hard work because you couldn't have the numbers of people on set that you would normally have. And this is a very small scale, TV pilot. Imagine if you are making a continuing drama like the likes of Casualty or EastEnders, the logistics of that show, those shows are miracles that they exist at all on the level that they do. The amount of output that continuing dramas in the UK actually produce is astonishing. So to do that with limited resources in a lockdown situation, there's a lot of people working behind the scenes that don't get the credit that they deserve. So we were very lucky. We managed to shoot, and we also managed to go back a few weeks later and do the pickups that we needed when we got into the edit suite virtually and looked at what we'd shot. So that was a fine balancing act, so that now as we, approach the end of the year, we're in post-production with that show, which is great. On the theatre side, completely dried up. I had a show on at London's biggest arts festival in February. We had planned to tour that over the summer at various festivals. Clearly that hasn't happened. And, people have said, what do you miss about ordinary life? And I think that the things I miss the most are things like travel and theatre, both of which I did a lot of for both personal and professional pleasure. But the theatre completely dried up. However, the audio drama, which is a show called The End of the Line, which is a series of monologues about how we treat women who don't have children and the stigma that being childless, or as we've tried to empower the phrase to be child-free, face from society. That managed to carry on, which was great. We had a bunch of stuff that we'd already recorded in 2019. The recording studio was able to stay open for a bit and then reopen in a socially distanced way, which was great. And because that's audio and the actress is on her own in the booth, that was great. That could carry on. And we're about to release the final 2 episodes of series 1 before we bring that back for another iteration, because I realized during lockdown that there are considerably more than the original 12 stories that we had planned. There are many more stories that we could tell. And the reaction has been extraordinary from people who've, had they've been really kind and got in touch to say, thank you for telling my story, or thank you for, portraying this side of the story, because the natural assumption is to think that women want to have children. And for many women, that is not the case. And we've tried to approach the subject in as careful and diligent manner as possible. And the result has been great. So we were very fortunate that was able to carry on. On the film side of things, we haven't been doing any shooting, but I've had a lot of meetings during lockdown. I was very fortunate. Most of my slate was all at the same stage, which was the development stage. And because producers and directors are not able to shoot, or at least most of them have not been able to shoot, they have the time to sit and develop with me. So it's been very strange working remotely. I guess we've all been working remotely, but when you add in time zone pressure, it's bizarre. So this evening, for example, at 6:00, this is on a Friday, I jump on with my director, John Amiel, who's based in Los Angeles. Your listeners will obviously have heard of Sir Sean Connery, who recently passed away, but he directed Sean in a film with Catherine Zeta-Jones called Entrapment, which was about...
I love that movie. I shouldn't, but I really do love it.
Yeah, great film. And I've been very fortunate to have a bit of a filmmaking masterclass from John over the last few months, because he's had the time to spend several hours a week. We've been doing several sessions via Zoom with him and the producer, Neil, going through the script, going through the backstory. There's nothing we don't know about these characters now. And we're in a great position. The location report has just gone off to the scouts, who will now get busy finding the right locations for the film. And hopefully, if we manage to turn a corner at some point in the spring, large scale or larger scale productions like this one will have a chance of shooting. I think any film that gets made is a miracle, whether it's a short film or an epic, feature. So if we are able to get on set and shoot it, that will be, nothing short of miraculous. But it's been a really, really busy time, because I wouldn't have had this access to John. I wouldn't have had his insight had this been, a normal year, whatever that means these days, because he would have been on set, and that would have meant I'd have been communicating with him probably via an assistant or probably via a producer, where messages can get diluted, where I might not necessarily understand the subtlety and the nuance of the written word. Whereas if I can see him just like I can see you now, I think that face-to-face communication you simply can't beat. It's not been face-to-face, it's been screen to screen, but that is the new face-to-face. So I will take it. And then we've also brought the podcast Behind the Spine back for a second series, which kicked off a couple of weeks ago. I interviewed for episode 1 Tristram Hunt, who is the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, about the narrative of curation, the responsibility of owning a collection as big as the V&A's, and about what he has called in his book, the lives of the objects. And we talk about the fact that normally we think about objects only at two phases of their existence. One, when they were first created, and two, when they came into the museum's possession. But of course, in between those two bookends, there was a life that they did live. They have experienced things, and they do tell stories. And the reason I wanted him on was, firstly, I thought he'd be a fascinating guest, which he was, but also because writers are conditioned to think about objects simply as props or business as they're known, whereas in actual fact, they do have a role, a significance. And he talked in a fascinating way about the plans for the museum, about how difficult it's been for them not to be able to open. And he did say something which I thought you and your listeners would be interested in, which he said, the V&A Museum is one of the most popular places in the country for people to propose to their partners, which I thought was quite nice. Almost as if human behavior is leading us to propose to our partners in a beautiful setting like the V&A.
Wow. I mean, that is a phenomenal list of things. And I think that that gives a sort of sense that you have been across different formats, looking at different stages of production. So you've got a really good handle on the sort of broad range of artistic output, and both in terms of the sort of the production of it, but also things like, as you say, museums and theatre, so physical spaces. There's a real sense from you talking, pun intended, the show must go on, and trying to deliver some things. And I'm very interested to sort of know what aspects of these sort of attempts to keep things on the road do you think will stay in place? Where have we discovered new ways of doing things? And where is it where actually there's a massive gap and we've really recognized it's missing?
Well, there's some great questions there. And your use of the phrase, the show must go on, reminded me of a group who brilliantly set up the show must go online, which has literally been for several weeks. I think creativity has really come to the fore at a time like this. I guess I'll start with a kind of a look ahead to my next guest. For his episode is coming out next week. A gentleman by the name of Guy Gadney, who is the chief executive of a company called Charisma.ai, which champions the storytelling immersive power of AI. And I was lucky enough to do a 2-day writer's room at the National Film and Television School last year with him and his team, looking at how you put yourself as you into the story and interact with the characters in a truly immersive way. They have done some extraordinary work during lockdown using actors who are available for work in an immersive storytelling opportunity. And we had a fascinating discussion about the amount of content that has gone online for free. And he uses a really interesting phrase, which I think has relevance from a behavior and human risk perspective, because he says free is just another word for nothing to lose. And I was fascinated by that, because that on its own sounds very harsh, because if you think about what people like the National Theatre were trying to do during lockdown, they put a huge amount of their back catalogue available online to let people watch. I think they did 6 or 7 weeks of premieres from shows that they'd had over the last 10 years since they'd started doing National Theatre Live. And they were all available for free. They're now not. You now have to pay. Now, initially, that was an attempt to, just entertain or provide some form of content for people in lockdown. As that has gone on, I think we've become more comfortable with certain things. We've become more comfortable with paying for online content. We've become more comfortable with the notion of the virtual tip jar. A lot of my friends are recording artists who have lost a huge amount of gigging income because there have been no music festivals over the summer, and pretty much all of them were lined up to do shows like Glastonbury, like Reading, or indeed some local concerts here in London. But that's not to say they haven't been working. They have. They've just been doing it online. So they've skilled up really, really quickly to have, multi-camera home studio setups. A lot of them had the equipment anyway because they are musicians. But things like a virtual tip jar, that is now literally a thing. We've said before, haven't we, that if you call it a thing, it is a thing. And the virtual tip jar, I think, has helped a lot of, a lot of people. In terms of what have I seen in change-wise, I think I've seen a validation of things we probably already knew. The power of the side hustle, for example, the importance of not just focusing on one core skill. It's to have an understanding across a range of the creative process. I've long believed that every writing education, whether that is formal study or watching videos on YouTube or however it is that you inform yourself, and all of those are perfectly reasonable, by the way. I'm not saying one is good and one is bad. What's really important is that writers have an understanding of what happens to their work. So I think that every writer should have the opportunity to go on set, to see what actors do with a script, to take it apart completely and really analyze it as a product, just as you would if you were in research and development, just as you would if you were making a vaccine. You need to understand every aspect of your product. And too often, writers will dash off a couple of lines of action description if it's a screenplay, or a paragraph of prose if it's a novel. In a novel, you can do that. In a screenplay, you can't without understanding the ramifications of it. So what sounds like something really simple in a screenplay actually might take 6 hours to shoot because of the nature of what it is. And if it's just a simple description, such as a car turning a corner, that's not just a car turning a corner. That's a closed road. That's police. That's having to warn the council. People write a lot of drone description in screenplays. Having shot in Surrey in lockdown, I can categorically state that it is easier to become the Prime Minister of this country than it is to get permission to have a 2,000-foot low-level drone over a residential area in Surrey, because the amount of permission that requires is extensive, all for the right reasons. But what may seem as a writer to be a very simple aerial shot isn't. And I think that having that breadth of understanding of the creative process is absolutely integral. And I know a lot of actors who have pivoted and developed their own home studios. So voiceover work hasn't gone away. There's a huge amount of voiceover work that's there. Clearly, you are better able to get voiceover work if you have your own home studio. And it's no surprise that there is a shortage of things like webcams, microphones, mixers, switch boxes, all of this stuff, because there is a huge amount of demand for people to have their own home studios. Not just actors, but professionals, people like you who need that sophisticated look on Zoom to differentiate your product. We're now looking at these things as being important. There are people offering classes in how to make your Zoom calls more engaging, or how to light your room better, or how to have, a decent camera angle. One of my hobbies has become watching people on Newsnight on Zoom. And you get a real sense of how seriously or not they take their appearance on Zoom, because some people have amazing backdrops, amazing bookcases. Some people, quite frankly, look like they're in a prison cell, and they might be in a prison cell. I don't know, but the most austere backdrop, I know that news programs historically have not liked doing anything down the line because they can't control the quality of the sound, the quality of the signal. They can't control any of the lag. Whereas now, that's become the norm. Stuff going down the line is how we do things. And I wonder what impact that might have for things like theatre. I've done a few read-throughs of scripts on Zoom. It's a bit clunky. It's quite hard. It's not necessarily perfect, but it's better than not having a read-through. I know a number of theatre companies who have been doing regular read-throughs of Shakespeare or regular read-throughs of plays, for which they can get the rights easily and for which they can sell tickets or have a virtual tip jar or, whatever it might be. My guest Guy has tried to plug all of those together and has actually, and I won't second guess it, but it would be, if people are interested in what might be coming down the line for the arts, then imagine a world in which you could be a part of something like a magic act, or they did a production of Alice in Wonderland in which there was a magic trick, and the magic trick, they got it to work on Zoom virtually and have that sense of wonder that you get with a magic act. I interviewed at the end of series 1 of Behind the Spine, Debbie McGee, who was Paul Daniels' wife and assistant for many, many years. And I said to her, why are we so fascinated by magic? We know inherently or intuitively that we are being deceived in some way. We know the magician is not actually creating a spell. It's sleight of hand. We know that. And it's not just sleight of hand either. It's sleight of hand combined with showmanship, combined with the patter, combined with everything that goes along with it. It's a package. And yet we still want to be deceived by it. So, she talked about the importance of being in the moment and the childlike joy that you get. Well, what Charisma AI are doing is starting to bring some of that wonder back through the use of artificial intelligence. And they came up with a beautifully simple concept of, well, if you were to get yourself into a story, who would you be? And they said the easiest thing that they could come up with was that you are you, because you inherently know everything about yourself and you will answer truthfully, as opposed to, potentially trying to put on an act. But imagine that. Imagine if you could put yourself into a story and interact with the characters in that story and have them respond to you in an authentic manner. Now, as a writer, that blows my mind, because that means that the possibilities for writing are literally endless, because you have to think of everything. Now, there can be some kind of machine learning for these characters, but if you just spend a little bit of time looking at the potential of that, then all of a sudden the arts has a potentially very bright future with regards to story and storytelling. Whether we are able quickly to get back into physical spaces like theatres in the numbers that we used to remains to be seen. There will be some theatres that do not survive, which will be a real tragedy for what's happened. But, and this may be quite a controversial statement to make, if we could fix all of the problems in the arts overnight through a huge dose of philanthropy, that would be a good thing. But it would also, and here's the controversial bit, potentially be a bad thing. And here's why I think that's the case. Because if we gloss over all of the problems in the arts as being entirely relevant to COVID, we miss some of the deeper entrenched problems that we already had as an industry, such as the lack of diversity, the lack of opportunity for people of color, the Me Too movement, the whole pay to play. And by that, I mean having to almost pay to be a part of, the cool gang at school, the way that writers get treated by producers, the way that producers expect things to be done for free for a very long period of time, the ever-present accusation that institutions like the BBC will only really work with a certain short list of writers. All of them are very good. All of them are extremely talented. But that list of writers does not have a monopoly on good writing. And there was a very, very famous speech by Chris Rock at the Oscars several years ago where he talked about the lack of black nominees. And he said a few very, very funny things, and you can watch the speech on YouTube. He said, if you want black nominations and black awards, have black categories. You already do it with men and women. There's no need to separate males and females in an acting category. And he said,
it's a really good point.
It's not track and field, right? And he says something like, you don't have a case of Robert De Niro saying, I better slow this acting down so Meryl Streep can catch up. There's no need to separate men and women in acting. But the most heartfelt bit of his speech is, all we want is the opportunity. He says, Leonardo DiCaprio gets a great role every year. Why don't black actors get that? And not just black actors, not just males, not just females. It's across the board that this lack of diversity is endemic. Now, things are starting to change. So a year or so ago, the British Film Institute changed its funding, and it said it wanted 50% of all of its funding to go to BAME-related projects. Great. Absolutely brilliant. But to come back to COVID did not create the lack of diversity in the arts. It did not create the Me Too movement, and it did not create the short list of writers that get used for lots of different productions. It has, in a way, masked those deeply entrenched problems. So when we talk about the future of the arts, I think we have to be honest and have a very serious conversation about the problems that were there pre-COVID and the problems that were probably already in the business model that COVID happened to expose. Now, if you look at the arts as being very similar to the airline industry, both of those industries exist only if you can guarantee bums on seats, literally in the case of the theatre. If bums on seats are not present, it becomes a very, very difficult business model to sell. Now, in London, we are very lucky in that we have a world-class West End that is, or was, typically full a lot of the time. But we also have regional theatres that rely on things like pantomime to make the most of their money. And a lot of talk at the moment is, I talked to someone the other day and I said, pantomime for a lot of theatre companies and a lot of theatres is essentially an extended 6-week Black Friday for the industry. That's what it's doing, is that you can make so much money to cover your costs during panto. But again, that business model only works if there are bums on seats. COVID didn't cause that. It just exposed it. So how can theatre in particular respond to that? And I would like to hope that there are lots of companies and theatres looking at themselves as a business and thinking, how do we best protect ourselves moving forward? Because anything that relies on the physical presence of its consumer is a very difficult sell, which is why people like Netflix have been doing very well, which is why certain businesses are booming at the moment, because they don't rely on the physical presence of a consumer. Theatre is spectacular and life-changing when it's done well, and some of it will sadly not come back. But, and again, I just want to hang in this space, because from a risk perspective and a behavioral perspective, we cannot, as an industry, miss some of the big challenges that we already had before COVID. So it would be great if some tech billionaire suddenly came in and saved the industry overnight. But if I were that billionaire, I would be insisting that that money to save the industry comes with a certain set of conditions. And they relate to everything that I've talked about Me Too, about the lack of diversity, about pay to play, and the way that people are treated. So the industry moving forward will move forward. It will move forward differently, and some bits of the industry will come out better than others. Some will never come back, sadly. But what I think we will take away from this is it is clear the extent to which the arts is vital in terms of the country and the world. We have moved very quickly towards realizing that novels, television programs, music plays a fundamental part in our lives. And when things get as bad as they have done this year, we have reached in our millions for those things, albeit in a virtual manner. So we know inherently that the arts is vital in terms of people's sanity, in terms of people's mental health, in terms of keeping us entertained, making us laugh, making us cry. So how do we then make sure that the industry continues in the format that we would like? I know a number of actors who now work in supermarkets or now work as delivery drivers because we have bills to pay. And those bills need to be paid. And if we can get jobs doing those sorts of things that are clearly in demand right now, then great. I have been fortunate and privileged to produce my own content in terms of the audio drama, and every single person involved in that has been paid and has been paid the going rate for that piece of work. But too often things are expected to be done for free. Now, that's fine if you're all in it together and you all own your own content with a view to selling it. But too many times, in fact, more often than not, writers get asked to do things for free. And writing is hard. And if you have a skill, you should expect to be paid for that skill. But yet there is an expectation. And again, the expectation is symptomatic of problems that already existed. As I said, we know inherently how important the arts is, and yet we run ourselves as an industry in a manner that we would not accept in big business, or we would not accept in politics, for example. And we don't. We see poor behaviors in politics and we call it out. We see poor behaviors in the arts. Do we call it out to the same extent? Maybe we do now, but these problems are not new. They've been there for many years. And it sounds like I'm being negative, and I really hope that your listeners understand I'm not. I'm just trying to be honest about what we as a business need to do to fix ourselves, because we cannot expect these problems to be fixed by money. It's not a financial thing. It's a human behavior thing. It's a way we treat each other thing. And that means that we need to take a long, cold, hard look at ourselves to realize our importance to the nation and to the world, and to say, hand on heart, yeah, we haven't done a good enough job here, so therefore we will fix it. And when the world turns bad, which it has done this year, art is more important than at any other time. We have in our, I discussed this with Tristram Hunt, we have in our millions been taking virtual tours of galleries and museums. We have been trying to get our fix of art and of creativity. We've downloaded more things. Book sales are going up. And yet cinema, let's just take a quick pivot and look at cinema. Cinema has, and I understand the reasons why, and they are financial, but cinema has withheld big budget, big box office films back because it relies on bums on seats, and it relies on franchising and on merchandising and on people buying popcorn. And if you take a cold, hard look at something like cinema, and you see the extent to which the theatres take a considerable part of the income, and I think you and I talked about this, several months ago. Here we are, kind of 7 months on, or whatever it is. The Bond film still hasn't been released. We still don't get a real sense of, we're probably more likely to get an indication of who the next Bond will be before we actually see Daniel Craig's finding outing as 007. And it's because if you spend all this money on a product and yet you don't just want them to settle for selling it to Netflix, who I'm sure would take it in a heartbeat. They would give several $100 million to MGM to kind of franchise that and put it on Netflix. And yet, no, we don't want that because we want people to see it in cinemas. And yet cinemas can't stay open because we're not giving them the product. So it's no wonder people like Cineworld have said we have no choice but to close. And you think, well, I would question that, because I think you probably could make it work. You probably could show different films. You don't need to show the Bond film. I know a lot of people have been at the BFI recently seeing some classic films from the 30s, 40s and 50s that are being screened. There is a desire. If you put content on, we will go and see it if we're allowed to. But if we hold it back, there is a sense that we are damaging ourselves. And again, that's been exacerbated and had a light shone on it by COVID. But any pressure on bums on seats means that parts of the arts, large parts of it, simply aren't sustainable. So we clearly need to do something about that. And again, I just want the industry to be honest and to try and move forward. And I would encourage artists everywhere to understand how critically important they are and to think about themselves as a business. We don't teach actors about the business of being an actor. We don't teach actors things like taxes and accounting, and the fact that you shouldn't spend all of the money you get because you have to give a substantial portion of it to the tax man at the end of the year. We don't teach that to actors. So what else are we not teaching them? What else are we not helping them understand? We teach writers how to write, but not necessarily what the implications of what they write are out in the real world. We don't teach them that you can't just write a drone shot because that's 3 months of paperwork and police visits and all of that kind of stuff. It is a business. And I've said repeatedly to the people that I interact with, perhaps the best piece of advice for a successful writing career is to focus more on the career than it is the writing. Because I think, as you and I discussed, if it were all about the quality of the writing, there would be nothing bad on television. And that quite clearly is not. That's right.
Wow. I mean, so much to unpick there. I'm sort of intrigued by this shining a light on hidden practices. We've started to recognize things. So, to your point on the Bond movie, it's deeply irritating. I can't watch it. And I know that that's because they're holding it back, right? Because they've announced that. I see other things. The Borat movie's released on Amazon. So you can clearly release big ticket items that way. You're just choosing not to do it. I think it's also fascinating, Ryan. You talked about technology, and, we've all suddenly got in our hands production tools where we can start to see, okay, I can now make a judgment call around how good I think this thing that's being pushed at me by Netflix or wherever it is, because I've got a sense of what it involved, because I can do some of these things myself. And I think it's just fascinating, all the pieces you talked about, which is there's a real, I think, recognition by everybody that things have got to change. And it feels like the tipping point that you've highlighted in society is perhaps unsurprisingly really being demonstrated, that tipping point that's there in the arts. And I think it's, there's reluctance to change in other respects that you've just mirrored beautifully there. So in many respects, the dynamics of culture and the arts are mirroring life. It's that old cliche that's genuinely happening, which is we can see a microcosm of some of the other societal pressures in what you were talking about.
Yes, absolutely. And that's not a comfortable realization for many of us. But it has been in play for a long time. The example I gave recently was related to A-level results, and COVID did not cause that monumental political catastrophe that was U-turn after U-turn. That was deeply entrenched failure of communication between regulators, teachers, government officials, departments, elected and paid representatives of governing bodies. That was them simply not talking to each other and not having a clear understanding of what was going on. That was always there. It just took COVID to shine a light on it. Amazon's a great example, the way that the Amazon computer works and thinks. And if you have spent any time sort of trying to understand, the notion of long tail economics, it's a brilliant ploy by Amazon, because what Amazon can do is sell you the latest John Grisham or the latest J.K. Rowling book. But anyone can do that. Anyone with an e-commerce platform can sell you that. What they can't potentially sell you are the really, really obscure things that Amazon can get hold of that they can sell you. So when this news was announced several years ago, but when Amazon announced that they'd commissioned a television series of The Lord of the Rings and they were going to spend X hundred million on it, they would effectively have looked at that, the television program that is, as the lost leader. Because they know that if they spend a couple of $100 million on, say, 10 episodes of The Lord of the Rings, they could probably sell $500 million in merchandise related to Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. A friend of mine is the director, head of legal affairs at Agatha Christie Limited. And that is a machine. That department is a machine that looks at every aspect of the IP related to Agatha Christie Limited. And of course, the big flagship franchise is the Kenneth Branagh helmed series of films with him as Poirot. But yes, it is interesting that is culture and the way that we perceive it, is that mirroring what is happening in society? Yes, it probably is. And in a way, that's its job. Its job is to shine a light on deeply entrenched problems like lack of diversity, like things like Grenfell Tower or the Windrush. That's what we're supposed to do as artists. We're supposed to say, this is not acceptable. Look at what is happening to these underrepresented people in society. And here is a very powerful message of what society needs to do. If only we were as good as doing that for ourselves as we were talking about it in a fictional perspective. It's almost as if we've given ourselves the answer. We're not taking our own medicine, and I don't understand why. There was, if you look back to the last time there was a truly catastrophic series of events if you look at the 1920s, the end of the Second World War, Spanish flu, and then roll the clock forward, the extraordinary creative output of the 1920s was amazing. It was about the collapse of the American dream and the futility of decadence and all of that, with F. Scott Fitzgerald writing things like The Great Gatsby, with Hemingway, everyone in Paris at the same time. We're very good at shining a light on the problems of society, but very, very poor about understanding that we ourselves suffer from the exact same problems and should therefore use our powers to fix them, as well as shouting about them, at the same time. I don't know why we don't do that, because it would seem the logical next step, if you've already highlighted the problem and created a solution for it in the form of drama or comedy or satire or whatever it might be, why not then apply that to yourselves as an industry? Other industries are very good at fixing themselves, quite often have to be told by regulators to do it. I've often talked about the fact that when banking executives used to say things like, oh, it was one bad egg that upset all the other ones, you think, no, it wasn't. It wasn't just a series of bad eggs. It was a series of deeply corrupt chickens and farmers and everything that goes with it. But they got away with the argument that it was just one bad egg. Now, when Sepp Blatter of FIFA tried the same tactic, he was ridiculed. But it was the exact same argument, that it was just one or two people. And he was forced to resign, whereas a lot of banking execs didn't. And they said lots of great things about what they did to fix themselves. But they only did it because they had to, or were told to, or because it had become blindingly obvious that the problem was there. It is blindingly obvious in the arts what the problems are. And yet, are we doing enough to fix it? And I think that momentum that we had has now been lost and overtaken by the fact that because of COVID, a lot of the industry will not return. And that is tragic in its own right. But it is also tragic that may mean we don't shine a light on ourselves as an industry, because the most pressing thing is the lack of money. And there's a lack of money because there's a lack of bums on seats. And there's a lack of bums on seats because we're not allowed out to go to the theatre. Now, you could argue that there are large parts of the population who never went to the theatre, and that would be true. But there are a vast amount of people who would regularly go to the theatre and would support fringe theatre, would support festival theatre, would support pub theatre, amateur theatre. They're all part of the same industry. And we're too quick to say that we want to have one set of rules for one part of the industry and another set for the other. That's not equitable. That's not embracing diversity. That's not encouraging grassroots. We've heard a lot about grassroots sport at the moment, and you've got the same situation. Grassroots sport, not allowed to play. Elite sport, allowed to play. I understand why that is, and I understand why you can bubble and you can make things safer, but you can only do that if you've got money. If you haven't got money, you can't necessarily survive. So when we think about things like sport, when we say sport politically, we don't mean all sport. We mean the elite stuff, the stuff that we know if we allow it to go on, people will watch and consume, because if we take sport away from them, we will get upset. But do we really care about grassroots sport? I don't think we do to the same extent. And I think the arts is the same. When we talk about the arts, some of us will navigate straight to the West End or to Broadway or to the Edinburgh Festival or for the big blue-ribboned, high-value, cachet parts of the arts. But we won't necessarily talk about amateur dramatics or pub theatre or things that bring people together or about pantomime. The annual nativity play at school, every school, well, most schools across the country will have some form of nativity play every year. That is part of the arts. That is getting bums on seats. Now, we may go because we have children and we don't have a choice to go, but it is a part. We've all been there, and that experience will probably be taken away or will look very different this time round. And I actually spoke to a young performer recently. I had a Zoom call with her and her mum because she was an entrant in a competition that I was a judge for. And I said to her, what might a socially distant nativity look like? How would you write that? How would you try and keep that going? And it kind of, it opened her mind up a little bit to what could be done. Her entrance in the competition were wonderful. One of them, it was her having a conversation with her Alexa device. And she'd written this story whereby Alexa was trying to stop her as the other character from eating the apples in the bowl of fruit that sat next to the Alexa device, because Alexa had decided that those individual pieces of fruit were her friends, and she wasn't going to allow this character to eat her friends. It was remarkable, what people have done, in lockdown. So I jumped on a Zoom call with her and her mum in an attempt to try and encourage her, because her school isn't. And, I think we need to check in with each other. We need to help each other. We need to produce stuff, and we need to call out poor behavior. And I include myself in that. I'm probably not as good as I should be about, pushing back and saying, well, actually, I think you are trying to get something for free there, and I want to be paid, my fee. And if I think about all of the problems that I've had this year, the only thing that COVID has stopped has been theatre. And for that, I feel very, very lucky, because there, but for the grace of God, go we all, right? That could have been a very, very different set of circumstances. And I know for some people that has been the case. And that's utterly tragic that they have had to, experienced overnight. Friends that were in West End shows suddenly weren't working and couldn't get work because there wasn't any work available. That's the fragility at which we were operating. So if we learn one thing, it must be a very deeply entrenched understanding that fragility, if you stress it, it will, in a catastrophic way, completely pull the rug out from under all of us. And as a business, if we're going to accept that, then we probably shouldn't have that place in people's hearts that we currently do. Because I think if people understood how the industry is run, they might think differently about it. And if we scratch away at that, then we'll never come back. And we would lose the one thing that we have above pretty much any industry that I can think of, except maybe sport, is that we have the power to touch people's lives forever. When you tell a story to a child, you light a candle in their mind that burns forever. When you can get people to laugh and cry in a theatre, it's life-changing stuff, and they never forget how you make them feel. But if we make them feel that we are not running this in a proper manner, they might not feel like that again, and they might get that from somewhere else. And then what do? Then we've sort of lost everything. And this would sound like a great monologue on stage talking about something else, but it's not a monologue. It's the reality that we're facing as an industry. And none of that is COVID related. So it's a very long-winded answer to your question about how is the industry changing. But the industry must change, and it must do so for many, many reasons. But most of those reasons were already problems that we'd ignored for a long time. So I don't know how confident I feel about our ability to address them now, because the whole thing, as I say, has been masked by COVID.
So many things and so little time remaining, so we'll have to get you back from them. But there's one bit I just want to pick up, which is sort of something you talked around earlier, which sort of I felt as a thread going all the way through, is that in many respects, the creative skills that the arts promotes, and I was thinking about children getting these things in as they practice acting, but as you go through, a lot of those things are so relevant to business nowadays, about how we tell stories, about the way that we engage people. The solutions to things like climate change will come from creativity and persuasion. So ironically, as we're looking, or perhaps not ironically, perhaps fittingly, you're looking at saying to the arts, you need to be more like businesses. You need to think about those things. You need to factor in things like resilience and plan around that. Don't expect to be around just because you're entitled to be, just because you've been there forever. So almost the same mindset of business. There's a flip side, which is business people need to start thinking much more around being creative and adopting some of the pieces from the arts. And so we're all having to become better communicators because of the nature of the format that's in front of us. We're all having to think differently, to have new ideas coming in. So I'm almost struck that it's almost, to your point, it's arts and artistic thinking is super relevant to business in a way that business thinking is now super relevant to the arts.
I completely agree. And it's a great point. And in addition to the things that I mentioned earlier, I've spent a fair chunk of time over lockdown running storytelling for business sessions for businesses. So I do some work with a number of organizations, which is a 2-hour workshop on how writers and storytellers think, how they see the world. Because here's what's really, really important is that we've been telling stories for longer than we've had language. We first used to tell stories by cave paintings, and we used to do so to try and make sense of the world or to pass on messages to other people about the dangers of the world. So once you get your head around the fact that storytelling is not a linguistic construct, it has been made a linguistic construct through the development of language, your mind gets blown and you think, well, if we can tell stories without language, imagine what we could do with language. So when I talk about how storytellers think or how filmmakers think or the concept of the hero's journey, which underpins every film you've ever seen in some part, when I talk about the basic tenets of speech writing that go all the way back to Cicero and Aristotle and haven't changed to this day. When I play you a recording of a Ronald Reagan speech from 1964 and a Michelle Obama speech from 2016, they are exactly the same, just with more hoopla at the Democratic National Convention and lots of cheering where there's no cheering with Ronald Reagan. But the underlying message is exactly the same. When I bring actors into an organization to help executives practice difficult conversations and to have the actor play back what it was like to be on the receiving end of the executive in that conversation, you can really open people's eyes up to the tone they set. You know, I use a phrase, you are your own weather. You set the weather in your organization. And if you are stormy, the people that work for you know. If you're sunny, the people that work for you, they know that. It's why things like improvisation and the whole nature, and it's often laughed at, but the whole nature of yes and is so important because so many business conversations start with yes, but, and that closes down. I know business people who, in response to the question, how are you, will say busy. That cuts a conversation dead like nothing else. So by embracing creativity and creative processes, executives and businesses can do many things. They can tell their stories better. And the better story you tell, the more engaged people will be. When you understand the biological reaction that occurs in someone's brain when they engage with a story and the hormone that is released, if you can do that and know how to do it, you can tell a great story. But you can't tell a great story if you lack impact or if you have no presence. And so businesses that do embrace the basic principles of storytelling and do embrace what actors can help them practice and even how they can help them present better, then there's a very interesting thing in the workshop that I do that I'll just share because it's really important. And it goes back to Aristotle and Cicero. And it's basically all about three things. It's about ethos, logos, and pathos. It's about the credibility of the speaker, the reasoning of the argument, and then the reaction of the audience. And the reaction of the audience, the pathos, the way you make people feel is by far and away the most important thing. You know, people will forget what you say, but they will remember how you make them feel. And that's what the arts does. And you can do that in business if you know how to do it. But if you don't, then your message is cluttered and confused and all of that. So I completely agree. The arts can do a huge amount for business in terms of storytelling, in terms of understanding the power of story and how we as human beings, you know, engage with it. The only thing that human beings are incapable of controlling is our emotions, because we don't know how we're going to feel. And sometimes we may feel sad or angry or whatever, but we can't control that. The only things we can control are what we do and what we say. But they are verbal and physical manifestations of an emotion that has already occurred inside us. And if we understand that, that's kind of great. But emotion is everything. The way you make people feel is critical. And just to double back to what I said earlier, the danger is that we make people feel bad about the industry because of the way we run it. And if that happens, as a storyteller, I can guarantee you that's terminal. There's no way back from that, because we will not be given a second chance, because we've all seen the film. We all know what happens. Once the hero starts to lose, things get very bad very, very quickly. And even if the hero wins, it's usually at great cost. Back to Greek mythology, that great cost would be death. So if we're taking a Greek myth or a mythos view of ourselves, we need to think very carefully about the next steps, because, you know, if we make people feel negatively about the industry, that could be fatal.
Incredible stuff. Thank you so much for that. There's so much to unpick there. A ton of links that I will put in the show notes, and most particularly because I think you will have sparked some interest in people how to get hold of you if they want to take you up on some of these themes that you've talked about and some of the services that you've covered. But thank you so much for that fascinating insight. I have learned a heck of a lot. I know my listeners will have done. So thank you very much for appearing once again on the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure, Christian. Thank you very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Mark for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Mark and the work that he does, have a look in the show notes. There's links to his company and the various projects he's involved with and the things he mentioned on the show. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the podcasting platforms. Listeners who like the show would do me a real favor by leaving a 5-star review on their platform of choice. It really does help. I'll be back very, very soon for the 99th and 100th episodes in this series. So look out for those wherever you found this episode. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.